Hi, this is Emerald and welcome to the Diamond Net, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the animus and how to integrate it. Alright, so before we jump into the video, I'm going to give you a quick definition of what the animus is first. And we have to define the animus in relation to the anima. So the animus and the anima in the Jungian psychological model refer to aspects of the psyche that are the inner opposite in every person. So Jung defined it as the animus being the inner man in every woman, and the anima being the inner woman in every man. And the idea within this framework is that connecting to the anima would give a person access to the unconscious mind, whereas integrating the animus has to do with the ability for the conscious mind to discern the messages of the unconscious mind. Now, Jung very much defined the anima and the animus in relation to gender. So the thought was that women have an animus and that men have an anima. Now, one thing that I've experienced is that I've had issues with repressing my feminine side, and I've also had issues with my anima. So I'm less inclined to think about this in relation to gender, though we can generally notice some patterns. Women are more likely to have issues with the animus than men are. But I tend to think that there's a lot of value in approaching this topic in such a way where we recognize that every person has both masculine and feminine, and we have to really own what's there if we want to have that connection between the conscious mind and the unconscious mind. Now, as I'd said before, the anima fundamentally has to do with connection to the subconscious mind, whereas the animus has to do with essentially sharpening up the conscious mind so that we can actually become more discerning, so that we can learn how to essentially convert the meanings and messages sent from the subconscious mind into a format that the intellect can understand. So to give an example of what this might look like when we have the feminine and the masculine aspects of the personality integrated, is that we have access to the unconscious, which sort of comes over us in waves in a very intuitive sense. So a lot of our emotions come from this space, so the emotions wash over us. And without the animus there integrated, what happens is that we're not quite able to discern the message and the meaning that's coming through from the emotions. We're not really getting the message that our body's trying to send to us. Whereas if we enable ourselves to really experience that emotion and we have our animus integrated, what happens is that we're able to discern things about that emotion. We're able to analyze it, categorize it, understand it internally, and then articulate it externally to others, being able to put words and concepts onto it. So essentially being able to convert something that isn't in an intellectual format into an intellectual format that other people can understand and that we can understand. Now, when we don't have our animus integrated, when stuff comes up from the unconscious, it tends to come up in such a way where we know it on one level, but we're not able to quite articulate it on this more verbal, intellectual level. And also, whenever the animus is disintegrated, it tends to behave in similar ways to how other aspects of the personality might behave, though the animus is a much bigger chunk of the personality than, let's say, your average run-of-the-mill aspect that ends up in the shadow. So the shadow is basically the blind spot of the psyche. This is where we put aspects of ourselves that we are uncomfortable with, that we don't like, that we think would be a threat to our ego or our worldview, or that we've put there because we've experienced some kind of trauma or have some unmet need relative to that aspect of ourself. And when these aspects end up in the shadow, they become autonomous from the conscious personality, meaning they have their own agenda, they have their own wants, needs, fears, perspective, separate from the conscious personality, separate from the person that we call me or I. And whenever shadow aspects become autonomous, they tend to lead us in directions we don't necessarily want to go in because their agenda is going to be different than what our conscious agenda is most likely. So the animus is no different. When we have a disintegrated animus, it also behaves autonomously from the conscious personality, meaning that it kind of has a mind of its own. It has its own agenda, it has its own needs, wants, fears, perspective, the same way other shadow aspects have. The distinction between the animus and the other shadow aspects is that the animus is more archetypal in nature, encompassing the masculine qualities of the personality on that more masculine, principled, archetypal masculine level. But in other ways, it quite behaves in similar ways to shadow aspects. Now, a common agenda that all unconscious aspects share is that they want to bring themselves back up into the conscious awareness again and to integrate with the rest of the personality. And so whenever an aspect that's been pushed into the shadow, that's been pushed into the unconscious, is trying to reintegrate, it'll employ different tactics to get the conscious personality to move more in that direction. And one tactic that it tends to use is projection. So a shadow aspect might choose a particular person or a group of people to project upon in hopes that the conscious personality will come to love and appreciate those people and thus drop resistance to that shadow aspect so that it integrates into the rest of the personality. Now, the animus works in quite the same way. Essentially, the animus is usually projected onto men as a whole group or individual men. And the way that this projection tends to come out is in the form of deep levels of attraction and deep levels of repulsion. So whenever the animus projects itself out onto people, essentially what it'll do is it'll project onto an individual man or men as a whole group. And then if we take the example of a woman who is having an issue with integrating the animus, what it will come up as is either a strong attraction reaction toward particular men or groups of men, and a strong aversion and a projection of what I call the terrible man onto individual men or men as a whole group. Very similar to the pedestaled woman that I spoke about in my video about the anima. And so this terrible man image, it's very power hungry, it's very powerful, it's very much in control of things, and it's very exploitative, and it has a lot of very ruthless qualities. Like if you can think about every negative association with the masculine, that's what this terrible man projection is like. And so whenever the animus is disintegrated, if we think about it as its own little mini personality, essentially it will project in these very negative ways, because whenever you cut off an aspect of yourself, it has similar reactions and similar emotions to what you would have if that happened to you. And so it's this part of the personality, but it behaves in this very ruthless way because this aspect of the personality is not happy with being disintegrated. Now, on the other hand, it's also trying to attract the conscious personality to it. And so it'll also project these idealized visions of men and masculinity. So there tends to be that real attraction, aversion, reaction to the animus figure. Now in the next part of the video, I'm going to be going into some of the telltale signs of animus disintegration. This tends to come up in two different ways, which can happen concurrently, or a person can have a lean toward one direction or the other. But basically you have either animus repression, which means that the animus just isn't really coming to the table, those masculine qualities aren't being shown in the personality, or you can have it in the form of animus possession, where essentially the masculine qualities are coming in a very overbearing, like stronghold kind of way, where there's this sense of like it's kind of taken over the personality. So first I'm going to start with the symptoms of animus repression. So lack of individuation is one. So when there's lack of individuation, this means not quite growing the personality into its own thing. And it's sort of having to do with like sublimation into the group and groupthink, you know, not being able to think for oneself. Also vagueness, so a sense of like confusion around what do I want, like where are my boundaries at. Also lack of discipline, indecision, lack of direction, lack of ambition, inability to make sense of the emotions, which also plays into lack of direction because it's our emotions that are our compass for being able to tell which direction we should go in. And then also disconnection from personal sovereignty. And this tends to lead into things like codependency, where a person essentially looks outside of themselves for direction. And instead of saying, what do I want? What do I need? What do I feel? Where are my boundaries? It's, what is this other person expecting of me? How can I make this person happy? What does the group want from me? And also inability to see the big picture. So inability to zoom out from things. So an example of someone who might be in this place of animus repression would be somebody who was maybe raised in a society where there was a lot of limitations placed upon them. So you want to think about, let's say, if there was a society where like women weren't able to really develop their individuality, and so the women in that society were essentially kept in a very narrow space where they couldn't really individuate. So that would be like one example of a person who might end up in that situation. But it doesn't necessarily have to be a society-wide thing. You could also have it in the form of somebody who was, let's say, raised in a particular family, and that this child was just extra obedient and never disobeyed their parents and always did what was expected. And so they never got to experience that rebellion and that individuation from their parental figures. So this can also be an example of how like animus repression might come up. Now, the primary cause for why we might have a disintegrated masculine side in the form of animus repression, where it's just not coming to the table, tends to be related very much to what our social group expects of us. So Gabor Mate has a great quote, and I'm going to botch it here, but he basically says something to the nature of we have two needs. One is for attachment, one is for authenticity. And if we have to choose between them, we're going to choose attachment every single time. And so oftentimes when it comes to the repression of the animus, it comes from being in a social group that is, let's say, restrictive of how we're going to be individuating. And so the desire to stay connected to the group, getting in the way of the individuation process, of the ability to think for oneself, the ability to stand in personal sovereignty, to make up one's own mind about things, and feeling like you have to outsource your thinking to someone else, to some external authority figure. So for someone who is dealing with repression of the animus, where the animus just isn't really coming to the table, where that individuation just hasn't happened, my main bit of advice is to develop your own perspective. So essentially, if you notice yourself always outsourcing your opinions to other people and saying, oh, what would that person expect of me? What does that person think? What does that person feel? Start thinking, what do I want? What do I think? What do I feel? Starting to own the personal sovereignty, starting to take up more space, carving out space for yourself. Also, practicing setting boundaries is really important here. So getting really in touch with your feelings of anger, your feelings of disgust, your feelings of sadness, some of those negative emotions, and being able to say like, oh, I don't like this, I'm going to set a boundary here. Or, oh, I actually do like that, I'm going to go in this direction, but oh, I don't feel comfortable with that. So starting to make those decisions more on how you feel about things. Also, another thing is getting very comfortable with rebellion and iconoclasm. Essentially, being able to like travel off of the beaten path. So if there's an expectation of going this way, feeling more comfortable with going off-road, feeling more comfortable carving out more space for yourself to do what you want to do. Now, on the flip side of animus repression, we also have animus possession, and some of the telltale signs of animus repression are as follows: being armored and protective of the self, disconnection from the emotions and instincts. So while somebody who is dealing with animus repression might get overwhelmed by their emotions and instincts and not being able to discern them, there tends to be more of a disconnect from the emotions and instincts. Disconnection from the body, and even having an antagonistic relationship to the body. So being up in the head all the time, feeling very, very uncomfortable in one's own skin. Shutting down, overworking, never accepting help, extreme independence, walling off to others, never being vulnerable. Again, it has a lot to do with protection, it has a lot to do with keeping other people out. Aggressive or passive-aggressive behavior, isolation, rebellion for rebellion's sake, never sitting still, and also seeing men as an extension of the animus. Now, the places where I've seen animus possession come up the very most is in women who are always on the treadmill of work and home and always never really getting to rest. You know, so a woman who's always on all the time. So I kind of think about like, if you've ever watched BoJack Horseman, Princess Carolyn is a good example of a woman who's dealing with animus possession. Now, there are two main reasons why animus possession might come up. So one is more of a collective thing and one is more of an individual thing. So the individual thing is that the animus comes up specifically to protect the person. So usually there's some kind of negative situation or some kind of trauma that happens at some point in life, and then that person comes to armor themselves against whatever that is. They hide the more vulnerable aspects of their personality, they push their feminine side into the shadow, and then they bring the animus out into the forefront because there's a protection mechanism happening. They're putting up a shield, they're putting up armor. Now, the more collective reason for why animus possession might come up is because we live in a society that values masculine principled values most of all, and feminine principled values aren't oriented to quite as much. So masculine principled values are essentially archetypally masculine values like doing and change and transformation and forward movement and ideas and ideals and all things of the intellect and working and all these different things that we really value as a society. Whereas the feminine values aren't really given as much attention. So things like stillness and being and creativity and the appreciation of just existing as a person. And so because we slant our values more in the direction of the masculine, oftentimes if somebody has a naturally more feminine personality, they have to kind of polarize over into their secondary energy, which is masculinity. And so in the extension over into the masculine side, this can create kind of a possessive relationship between the masculine aspect of the personality and the rest of the personality. So essentially, and especially if that overextension is because the person has internalized the idea that masculine principled values and the masculine principle in general is more valuable than the feminine principle. So there can also be an element of protection there where someone might polarize over into the animus and have the animus really take on a possessing role to protect themselves from a perceived inferiority that was picked up from society having more of the masculine principled slant. So when it comes to integrating the possessing animus, essentially what we have to do is we have to look for the reason why the animus has become possessive in the first place. So the animus becomes possessive fundamentally to protect. And so if we can look and see what we're trying to protect ourselves from, and we address it at the root cause, oftentimes this unravels the need for us to have the animus way out there in the forefront and taking that possessing role. And so let's say, for example, I'm trying to protect myself from feelings of ostracism. And so what might happen is my animus might take a possessing role, and I might start isolating myself and being hyper independent and trying to stay away from people, not connecting to my emotions relative to people, because I'm trying to protect myself from people. And so if I go in and I deal with that at its root cause, chances are my animus will no longer have a need to really take on that possessing role, and it can come more into alignment where it's supposed to be in the personality, integrated as opposed to taking a stronghold. Anyway, so that's all I have for you for today. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, go ahead, click the like button below and subscribe. Also, be sure to click the link below for my Shadow Integration Masterclass, 6 Simple Steps to Shadow Integration. It's a free 1-hour masterclass, and it has everything that you need to start your own shadow work practice today. So I'll go ahead and I'll leave the link down below in the comments and in the description box. All right, so that's all I have for now, and keep becoming more you.